My name is Imani Okafor. I am 34 years old, and for almost 2 years, the richest man in Manhattan stared at my kitchen window every single morning and never once knew my name. I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened, not the way the newspapers told it later, not the way my own mother retells it at church when she thinks I'm not listening. The real version, the quiet version, the one where a woman with nothing the world considered valuable ended up owning the only thing a billionaire couldn't buy. I grew up in a small apartment in the Bronx, the daughter of a Nigerian father and an African American mother from South Carolina. My father drove a livery cab for 26 years. My mother taught second grade at the same public school for almost as long. They did not raise me to chase money. They raised me to notice things, to pay attention. My mother used to say, "Imani, the world rewards loud people, but life rewards the ones who watch." I did not understand what she meant until I was 33 years old, standing at a window in Lower Manhattan, watering a tomato plant that would change 2 lives. I moved into that apartment after my divorce. It was a rent-stabilized studio on the 5th floor of a narrow brick walk-up, wedged between two glass towers that had grown up around it like weeds around a stone. My landlord was an old man named Mr. Petrov, who owned the building in 1971 and refused again and again to sell. The rent was $390 a month in Manhattan in 2024. People did not believe me when I told them. The apartment had one real feature, and that was the window. A single tall window in the kitchen with an old wooden sill my husband and I had refinished together back when we still believed in each other. I took the sill with me when I left him. I had a friend help me unscrew it from the wall of our old place in Queens, and I installed it in the new apartment with my own hands. On that sill, I kept a single clay pot, and in that pot, I grew a tomato plant. My grandmother grew tomatoes in Beaufort, South Carolina. My mother grew them in the Bronx. I grew mine in Manhattan. It was the only thing in my life that felt like it belonged to a line older than my own loneliness. I worked as a night auditor at a midtown hotel. I would come home around 7 in the morning, exhausted, and the first thing I always did before sleeping was water that plant. Always at 6:47 a.m., give or take a minute. It became a ritual. The light at that hour fell straight down into the alley between my building and the tower across from mine, and for about 40 seconds, my whole window turned gold. I noticed him on a Tuesday. It was March. The plant had just started showing its first yellow flowers. I was holding a small glass watering can, and when I looked up, I saw him. A man in a charcoal suit standing at a floor-to-ceiling window on the 38th floor of the building directly across the alley. He was holding a coffee cup. He was looking down, not at the city, not at the street, at my window. I was so surprised that I waved. He did not wave back. He just stood there, perfectly still, the way a deer stands still in a clearing when it knows it has been seen. Then he turned and walked away from the glass. I felt foolish for an entire week. I told myself I had imagined it. He was probably looking at his phone, at the building, at anything but me. I am a black woman of average height and average dress and an entirely average life. Rich men in penthouses do not stand at their windows to look at people like me. But the next morning at 6:47, he was there again, and the next, and the one after that. His name was Arthur Caldwell. I did not learn it until later, but I will tell you now so you can carry it with you. He was 36 years old at the time, white, born in Greenwich, Connecticut. He had inherited his father's real estate firm at 29 and tripled its holdings in 6 years. 14 skyscrapers, Manhattan, Chicago, Dallas, Miami, 2 in Boston. He was on the cover of business magazines I would never read. He was the youngest billionaire in commercial real estate in the country, and the building he stood in every morning was the headquarters of Caldwell Holdings, named for his late father. His penthouse office faced east. My window faced west. The alley between us was 22 feet wide and 38 floors deep. We were closer to each other geographically than I was to the deli on my own corner. For months, I told no one, not my mother, not my sister, not the women I worked with at the hotel. It felt private, the way some things have to feel private to stay real. I would water the plant. He would stand at the window, we would not acknowledge each other, and then we would both go back to our lives, which were not the same kind of life at all. Around the 4th month, I started leaving things in the window. I do not know exactly why. Maybe because I am the daughter of a woman who teaches 2nd grade, and I have always believed that human beings need small gifts more than they need large ones. I left a hand-painted card that said, "Good morning." I left a small paper crane my nephew had folded. I left a Polaroid of the tomato plant in full bloom. I never saw him pick anything up, of course. He could not have. The alley was too deep, my window was too low, and the only thing that traveled between us was sight. But something was happening. I could feel it. That January, the city had a snowstorm that buried us, 21 inches in a single night. I woke up to find the alley between our buildings impassable, which was unusual because that alley was a private easement and rarely cleared by the city. I bundled up to walk to the bodega and discovered that someone had already plowed it, just my side, just enough to reach the street. The super said a private crew had come at 4 in the morning. Cash payment, no name on the work order. I knew. I did not say it out loud, even to myself, but I knew. A month after that, the letters arrived. The building was being sold. A development conglomerate had acquired Mr. Petrov's deed in what they described as an off-market transaction, language designed to mean nothing while doing everything. All 41 tenants had 90 days to vacate. The compensation offered was $4,000 per household. Manhattan, $4,000. There were elderly people in my building who had lived there since the Carter administration. There was a young couple with a newborn on the 3rd floor. There was Mrs. Delacroix on the 2nd floor, 81 years old, who had buried 2 husbands in that apartment and intended to be buried from it herself. The name on the letter was a shell company, 3 initials and a number. I did not recognize it. None of us did. That night, I stood at my window and looked across the alley. The penthouse light was off. For the first time in almost 2 years, Arthur Caldwell was not standing at his glass. I felt something then that I had not let myself feel in a long time. It was not quite anger. It was the steady, unshakable calm that comes over a woman who has decided. My mother has that calm. My grandmother had it. It is the inheritance of women who have been underestimated their entire lives and have learned to use that underestimation like a hidden blade. I organized the tenants. I drafted a letter. Not a petition, not a complaint, a letter. Handwritten in the careful cursive my mother had drilled into me as a child on good cream paper I had to walk to a stationery store in Soho to buy. I addressed it to Mr. Arthur Caldwell, Caldwell Holdings, personal attention. I did not know for certain that the shell company was his. I suspected. The acquisition had moved too cleanly, too quietly, and the building it was clearing space for was going to be a luxury annex to the very tower he stood in every morning. But I did not accuse him in the letter. I simply described the building. I described Mrs. Delacroix. I described the newborn on the 3rd floor. I described in one short paragraph near the end a woman who waters a tomato plant at 6:47 every morning and who has noticed for almost 2 years a man who watches her from a window across an alley and who hopes that man is the kind of man who would want to know what his companies are doing in his name. I walked the letter across the street myself. The doorman at Caldwell Tower was a tall Dominican man named Hector. He tried, politely, to dismiss me. I told him I was not leaving until he agreed to put the letter in Mr. Caldwell's hand personally. I mentioned the window. I mentioned the tomato plant. Something in his face shifted. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "Yes, ma'am." 3 days later, a black car pulled up outside my building. The driver, an older man in a gray cap, came to my door and handed me an envelope. Inside was a single card. "Mrs. O'Facker, would you do me the honor of coffee at your convenience at the address below? A. Caldwell." The address was a small cafe on Pearl Street, not his office, not a power move, just coffee. I went. I wore my mother's good navy dress and my grandmother's pearl earrings, and I carried myself the way my father carried himself when he walked into rooms designed to dismiss him, which is to say, I carried myself like a person who had nothing to prove and therefore could not be diminished. He was already there when I arrived. He stood up when I walked in. He was younger in person than I had expected. The suits and the magazine covers had aged him in my mind, but in person he was just a man, 36 years old, with tired eyes and a careful, almost cautious way of holding himself, like someone who had learned early that his size and his name took up more space than they wanted them to. He said, "Mrs. O'Facker, thank you for the crane." I had folded a paper crane into the envelope with the letter. I had not mentioned it. He pulled a small leather folder from the chair beside him and set it on the table between us. Inside, neatly arranged, were every card I had ever placed in my window, every paper bird, the Polaroid of the tomato plant, the hand-painted good morning. Almost 2 years of them. He had photographed each one with a long lens from his office, printed them, and kept them in this folder, which he carried, he said quietly, with him to most of his meetings. I did not know what to say, so I said nothing, and I let him talk. His wife had died 3 years before I ever moved into that apartment. Ovarian cancer. She was 31 years old. They had been married 4 years. Her name was Eleanor, and she had grown tomatoes on the deck of their apartment in Tribeca because she had grown up on a farm in Vermont and could not, she always said, live in a city that did not let her grow at least one living thing. After she died, he could not stay in that apartment. He moved into the penthouse 2 floors above his office because it was the one place in the city where he did not have to walk past her things. He could not sleep. He would stand at his window at dawn because the city was silent then, and one morning, almost 2 years ago, he had looked down into the alley and seen a woman watering a tomato plant on a wooden sill at exactly the angle his wife used to stand at their deck, with exactly the same patient half-turn of the wrist. He had never approached me, he said, because he did not want to disturb something that had become, without my knowing it, the only part of his day that felt like grief and not like business. He said, and I remember the exact words because I have turned them in my mind 1,000 times since, "Your window is the only place in this city that still feels like a home and not a transaction." Then he told me about the building. He had not known. The acquisition had been routed through a subsidiary of a subsidiary, the way these things are, and the development team operated with broad discretion. He had signed off on the quarterly portfolio summary without reading the line items. When he received my letter, he had walked down to the legal floor himself and demanded the files. He had spent the night reading them. He had not slept. He was killing the project, not pausing it, killing it. The building would stay. The tenants would stay. He was going to put the building into a community land trust so that no future acquisition, including by his own company after he was gone, could ever displace the people inside it. And he wanted to write me a personal check, a large one, as an apology for what had almost happened in his name. I told him no. I told him I had not walked across the street for money. I told him I had walked across the street because 40 families were going to lose their homes, and I happened to be the woman whose window he could see. I told him the only thing I would accept was the land trust and the guarantee, in writing, that Mrs. Delacroix in the second floor would die in her own bed, in her own apartment, on her own schedule, with no one ever again sending her a letter that told her she had 90 days to disappear. He agreed to all of it before our coffee was cold. We sat in that cafe for almost 3 hours. He asked about my family. I asked about his wife. He showed me a picture of her on his phone, a small, freckled woman in a sun hat, holding a tomato up to the camera like a trophy. I told him about my grandmother in Beaufort. He told me his father had not been a kind man, and he had spent most of his adult life trying to build something his father would have approved of, and only recently had he started to wonder if that was the same thing as building something worth building. When we parted on the sidewalk, he did not try to hug me, and he did not try to shake my hand in a way that would have made me feel small. He simply nodded, the way you nod to someone you have known a long time, and he said, "I will see you tomorrow morning, Mrs. Okafor." And he did. That was almost a year ago. The building is in the trust now. Mrs. Delacroix is still on the second floor. The newborn on the third floor is a toddler. My tomato plant produced 14 tomatoes last summer, which I considered, given the circumstances, a small private joke between me and the man across the alley. I sent 2 of them in a brown paper bag across the street with Hector. Arthur sent back a handwritten note that said simply, "They taste like Vermont. Thank you." We are not friends exactly. I do not have his phone number. He does not have mine. We have had coffee 3 more times in the past year, always at the same cafe on Pearl Street, always for no particular reason except to sit in the company of someone who knows what the other one has lost. But every morning at 6:47 a.m., I water my plant, and he stands at his window, and sometimes he raises his coffee cup, and sometimes I raise my watering can, and that is the whole of our friendship. And it is enough. I have thought a great deal in the years since all of this happened about what I owned and what he owned and what the difference was. Arthur Caldwin owned 14 skyscrapers. He owned the skyline of 3 American cities. He owned more square footage of glass and steel than most countries' armies own of land. And for almost 2 years, the only view in his entire empire that gave him peace was a window he did not own, in a building he was, without knowing it, about to demolish. I owned a wooden windowsill, a clay pot, and the discipline to water a plant at the same time every morning for 2 years, even when I was tired, even when I was sad, even when no one was watching, except, as it turned out, one person was. That was the asset, the watching, the tending, the showing up, the refusing to let the city, with all its noise and all its money, talk me out of the small daily acts that made my life mine. My mother was right. The world rewards loud people, but life, the deeper thing underneath the world, the thing that decides who sleeps at night and who does not, life rewards the ones who watch, the ones who tend, the ones who keep growing tomatoes on windowsills in cities that have forgotten what tomatoes are for. He owned 14 towers. I owned the only window he looked out of. And in the end, when his life was at its loudest and his nights at their emptiest, it was my windowsill he came back to. Not because I was rich, not because I was anyone, but because I had built, without ever meaning to, the one thing his money could not build. A home in a city of transactions, a small, growing, living thing in a world of glass. A woman at a window at 6:47 a.m. doing the same small, faithful thing she had done the morning before and would do the morning after, whether anyone was watching or not. Tend what is yours, faithfully, patiently, without applause. You may never know who, from what height, is watching you do it, but someone, somewhere in a tower you cannot see into, is being saved by the steadiness of your hands.